I was 68 when I realized my family saw me as nothing more than a burden. The word stung, sharp as a blade, when I overheard it slip from my daughter Clara's lips during a heated argument with her brother, James, in the kitchen of my old Victorian home. They thought I was asleep upstairs, my frail body tucked beneath the quilts my mother had sewn decades ago. But I crept down the creaky staircase, driven by a restless ache in my chest. Their voices carried through the oak door. Clara's sharp and venomous. James's low and resigned. "She's just a burden now," Clara said, her words slicing through the air. "Always needing something. Always in the way." James didn't disagree, only murmured something about the cost of my care, the inheritance they were waiting to claim. I stood frozen, my hand trembling on the banister, the weight of their betrayal sinking into my bones. I'd given them everything me love, my time, my savings, and yet, here I was, reduced to a problem they couldn't wait to be rid of. I returned to my room that night, silent as a ghost, and lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The house, with its peeling wallpaper and drafty windows, had been my sanctuary, the place where I'd raised Clara and James after their father left us. It was all I had left, along with the fortune I'd built through years of quiet investments, a fortune they assumed would be theirs. But as the hours ticked by, a fire kindled in my chest, not of anger, but of clarity. They thought I was weak, a fading relic. They were wrong. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table, sipping tea, my hands steady despite the storm inside me. Clara bustled in, her smile tight and practiced, asking if I needed help with my medication. I waved her off, my voice calm but distant. James followed, his eyes avoiding mine as he muttered about work. They didn't know I'd heard them, didn't know the shift that had begun in me. I spent the day sorting through papers in my study, the room where I'd once helped them with homework, where I'd cried over their father's abandonment. Among the dusty files, I found my will, its pages yellowed but intact. I read it slowly, my fingers tracing the lines that left everything me house, my savings, my investments to Clara and James. Equal shares, as I'd always planned. But now, those words felt like a betrayal of myself. I tucked the will back into its folder, my mind racing. I wasn't ready to die. Not yet. And I certainly wasn't ready to let them bury me alive. That afternoon, I called my lawyer, Margaret, a sharp woman who'd handled my affairs for decades. She arrived within the hour, her gray suit crisp against the faded grandeur of my home. Sitting across from me in the study, she listened as I explained what I'd heard, my voice low but steady. I didn't cry, though my throat tightened with every word. Margaret's eyes softened, but her professionalism held firm. "What do you want to do, Eleanor?" she asked. I leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking under my weight, and told her I wanted to change my will. Not out of spite. I insisted, though the lie tasted bitter on my tongue. I wanted justice, a way to reclaim the dignity they'd stripped from me. Margaret nodded, pulling out her notebook. "We can draft something new," she said, "but you'll need to be clear about who gets what." I thought of Clara's cold words, James's silence, and then, unexpectedly, of Sarah, the young nurse who'd been coming to the house for months, helping me with my medications, my mobility, my loneliness. Sarah, with her kind eyes and gentle hands, who listened to my stories and laughed at my terrible jokes. She'd never asked for anything, never treated me like a burden. I looked at Margaret and said, "I know exactly who I want to leave it to." The decision felt like a rebellion, a quiet uprising against the family I'd loved so fiercely. Clara and James had grown into strangers, their loyalty eroded by greed and resentment. I'd seen the signs for years: Clara's impatience when I moved too slowly, James's sighs when I asked for help with the groceries, but I'd ignored them, clinging to the hope that they still loved me. Now, that hope was gone, replaced by a resolve I hadn't felt in years. I spent the next few days watching them closely, their every word and glance under scrutiny. Clara fussed over me with exaggerated care, her eyes darting to the antique clock on the mantel, as if counting the minutes until she could leave. James was quieter, but his distance was palpable, his visits brief and perfunctory. I played along, letting them believe I was the same frail, oblivious mother they dismissed. But inside, I was planning, my mind sharp and alive. Sarah came every morning, her presence a balm to the wounds my children had inflicted. She'd sit with me in the garden, the late summer roses wilting around us, and talk about her dreams, modest ones, like opening a small clinic to help people who couldn't afford care. I listened, marveling at her selflessness, so different from the entitlement I'd seen in my own children. One day, as she helped me prune the rose bushes, I asked her why she was so kind to me. She smiled, her hands pausing on the shears. "You remind me of my grandmother," she said. She was strong, even when the world tried to make her feel small. Her words hit me like a wave, stirring memories of my own mother, who'd raised me alone after my father died. I realized then that Sarah saw me, truly saw me, in a way my children no longer did. That night, I made up my mind. The will would change, and Sarah would be the one to inherit everything, not because I wanted to punish Clara and James, but because I wanted to honor the person who'd shown me I was still worth something. The process of rewriting the will was meticulous, every detail a deliberate act of defiance. Margaret came daily, her briefcase stuffed with documents. As we worked through the legalities, I left the house to Sarah, along with the bulk of my savings and investments. I included a small trust for my grandchildren, Clara's 2 boys, because they were innocent in this. But for Clara and James, I left only a letter, one I'd write myself, explaining why I'd made this choice. I didn't want their anger, their accusations. I wanted them to understand. Margaret warned me they'd fight it, that they'd call me cruel, manipulative. I didn't care. This wasn't about revenge. Not entirely. It was about reclaiming my life, my worth, in the time I had left. As we finalized the documents, I felt a strange peace settle over me, like the calm before a storm. I knew what was coming: the confrontation, the fallout, but I was ready. For the first time in years, I felt like I was in control. The days following my decision were a delicate dance of secrecy and observation. I moved through the house with a quiet purpose, my cane tapping softly against the hardwood floors, my eyes sharp despite the fatigue that clung to my bones. Clara and James continued their routines, oblivious to the shift in me. Clara would breeze in after work, her heels clicking, her voice bright but hollow as she asked about my day. James was less frequent, his visits punctuated by excuses about deadlines and meetings. I nodded, smiled, played the part of the frail mother they expected, all while my heart thrummed with the weight of my secret. The new will sat locked in my study, its pages a silent testament to my resolve. I'd instructed Margaret to keep it confidential until I was ready to reveal it, though I wasn't sure when that moment would come. Part of me wanted to confront them now, to lay bare their betrayal and watch their faces crumple. But another part, the part that still loved them despite everything, hesitated. I wanted them to change, to see me again, to remember the mother who'd sacrificed so much. Yet with each passing day, their indifference hardened my heart a little more. Sarah noticed the change in me, though she never pried. During her visits, she'd catch me staring out the window, lost in thought, and gently ask if I was okay. I'd smile, deflecting with stories about the past me childhood. My mother's resilience. The early years with Clara and James when we were a family, not strangers sharing a name. Sarah listened, her eyes bright with empathy, and I found myself opening up more than I intended. One afternoon, as we sat in the sunroom with cups of chamomile tea, I told her about my husband's departure, how he'd left me with 2 young children and a mountain of debt. I'd clawed my way out, working late nights as a bookkeeper, investing every spare penny until I'd built something substantial. Sarah's hand rested on mine, warm and steady, as I spoke. "You're incredible, Eleanor," she said softly. "Not many people could do what you did." Her words were a lifeline, pulling me back from the edge of despair. I wanted to tell her about the will, about the gift I was preparing for her, but I held back. It wasn't time yet. The tension in the house grew, though Clara and James didn't seem to notice. They were too caught up in their own lives, Clara with her high-powered job and her boys' endless activities, James with his startup that never seemed to take off. I began to see their flaws more clearly, not with anger, but with a kind of detached clarity. Clara's ambition had hardened her, turning her warmth into calculation. James, once so sensitive, had become withdrawn, his dreams overshadowed by a quiet resentment. I wondered when I'd lost them, or if they'd ever truly been mine. The thought haunted me, but it also fueled me. I started making small changes, asserting myself in ways they didn't expect. I refused Clara's offer to hire a new nurse, insisting Sarah was enough. I asked James to fix the leaky faucet himself instead of calling a plumber, watching his frustration flare. These were tests, small prods to see if they'd rise to the occasion, if they'd show me something worth salvaging. They didn't. One evening, I overheard another conversation, this time in the living room. Clara was on the phone with her husband, her voice low but sharp. "It's only a matter of time," she said. "The house alone is worth millions. And then there's the investments. We just have to be patient." My blood ran cold. She wasn't just dismissive, she was calculating, waiting for my death like a vulture circling a dying animal. I retreated to my study, my hands shaking as I unlocked the drawer and pulled out the letter I'd been drafting for them. I wrote late into the night, pouring out my pain, my disappointment, my love that had never wavered despite their cruelty. The words flowed, raw and unfiltered, a reckoning of everything I'd held back. I sealed the letter, my heart heavy but resolute. They'd read it when the time came, when the will was revealed, and they'd know why I'd made my choice. Sarah's visits became the highlight of my days, a reminder that kindness still existed. She brought me books, read to me when my eyes were too tired, and shared stories of her own struggles to childhood and foster care. A mother who'd abandoned her, a life built on sheer determination. I saw myself in her, the woman I'd been before age and betrayal wore me down. One day, as we walked through the garden, I asked her what she'd do if she had money, real money, to make her dreams come true. She laughed, a little embarrassed, and said she'd open her clinic, maybe buy a small house where she could grow flowers. "Nothing fancy," she said, "just enough to help people and feel at home." I nodded, my throat tight, knowing I was about to give her that chance. That night, I finalized the will with Margaret over the phone, confirming every detail. The house, the savings, the investments, all to Sarah, with a small fund for my grandchildren and the letter for Clara and James. It was done. The weight of my decisions settled over me, both liberating and terrifying. I knew what it would do to my children, how they'd react when they learned the truth. Part of me still hoped they'd change before it came to that they'd see me as more than a burden, more than a means to an end. But deep down, I knew better. They'd made their choices, just as I'd made mine. I began preparing for the inevitable confrontation, steeling myself for their anger, their accusations. I wasn't afraid, not anymore. I'd spent too long living for them, sacrificing my own needs for their happiness. Now, I was choosing myself, choosing Sarah, choosing justice over blind loyalty. As I sat in my study, the will locked away, the letter sealed, I felt a spark of the woman I'd once been: strong, defiant, alive. The storm was coming, and I was ready to face it. The house felt heavier as the days passed, its creaks and groans mirroring the tension building inside me. I moved through my routines with a deliberate calm, masking the storm in my heart. Clara and James continued their visits, their interactions with me a blend of obligation and impatience. I watched them closely, searching for any sign of remorse, any flicker of the love we'd once shared. But Clara's smiles were too tight, her questions about my health laced with a subtle eagerness, as if she were counting down the days. James was no better, his silences louder than words, his eyes darting to his phone whenever I spoke. I began to feel like a stranger in my own home, a ghost they wished would fade away. Yet, with every slight, every careless word, my resolve grew stronger. The will, locked in my study, was my secret weapon, a quiet rebellion against their indifference. Sarah remained my anchor, her presence a reminder of what I was fighting for. She'd bring me small gifts, a jar of homemade jam, a book of poetry, and we'd spend hours talking, the kind of conversations I hadn't had in years. She told me about her plans for the clinic, how she'd make it a place where no one felt alone or forgotten. I listened, my heart swelling with pride, as if she were my own daughter. One morning, as we sat in the garden, the air thick with the scent of roses, I almost told her about the will. The words were on my tongue, but I swallowed them back. I wanted it to be a surprise, a gift she'd receive when the time was right. Instead, I asked her about her childhood, probing gently into the pain she'd overcome. Her eyes grew distant as she spoke of foster homes, of learning to rely on herself. "You're stronger than you know," I told her, and she smiled, unaware of how much her strength had inspired me. The tension in the house reached a breaking point one evening when Clara and James came for dinner. I'd cooked, a rare effort that left me exhausted but determined to create a moment of connection. The dining room was warm with candlelight, the table set with my mother's china, a relic of better days. Clara arrived late, her face flushed from a long day, and James was distracted, checking his phone under the table. I served the meal: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, and tried to steer the conversation toward memories, hoping to rekindle something. I spoke of their childhood, the summers we'd spent at the lake, the nights I'd read them stories. But Clara cut me off, her voice sharp. "Mom, we don't need a history lesson," she said, slicing into her chicken. James chuckled, but his eyes were cold. I felt the sting of their dismissal, but I kept my composure, my hands steady as I poured more wine. After dinner, as they lingered over coffee, I decided to test them one last time. I mentioned the house, casually, saying I'd been thinking about its future. Their heads snapped up, their interest sudden and palpable. "What do you mean, Mom?" Clara asked, her tone too eager. James leaned forward, his phone forgotten. I shrugged, playing the part of the frail old woman they expected. "Just thinking about what happens when I'm gone," I said. "The house, the money, it's a lot to consider." Clara's eyes narrowed, and James cleared his throat, mumbling something about how they'd take care of everything. Their greed was so blatant, so unmasked, that it took my breath away. I excused myself, claiming fatigue. and retreated to my study, my heart pounding. They hadn't even pretended to care about me, only about what I'd leave behind. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my desk. The letter to Clara and James opened before me. I added to it, my pen moving with a quiet fury. I wrote about their words, their betrayal, how they'd made me feel like a burden in my own home. I wrote about Sarah, how her kindness had shown me what family could be. I didn't hold back, letting every ounce of pain and disappointment spill onto the page. When I finished, my hands were shaking, but I felt lighter, as if I'd unburdened myself of years of unspoken hurt. I sealed the letter and placed it with the will, knowing it would be the final word they'd hear from me. The thought of their reaction shock, anger, maybe even regret sent a chill through me, but it also felt right. This wasn't just about punishment. It was about truth. The next morning, I called Margaret to confirm the will was airtight. She assured me it was, but warned me again about the fallout. They'll contest it, she said. They'll call it coercion. Say Sarah manipulated you. I laughed, a sound that surprised even me. Let them try, I said. Sarah doesn't even know. Margaret paused, then asked if I was sure. I was. For the first time in years, I felt certain of something. I spent the rest of the day with Sarah, helping her plant new flowers in the garden, the simple act grounding me. As we worked, I noticed Clara's car pull into the driveway. She stepped out, her face tense, and called for me from the porch. I waved her over, my heart steady. She approached, her eyes scanning Sarah with a flicker of suspicion. Mom, we need to talk, she said. Her voice clipped. I nodded, knowing this was the beginning of the end. Clara's voice had an edge I hadn't heard before, sharp and brittle, as she stood in the garden with her arms crossed. Sarah excused herself, sensing the tension, and slipped back into the house, leaving me alone with my daughter. The air was thick with the scent of freshly turned earth and wilting roses, but it did nothing to soften the moment. Clara's eyes, so like mine when I was younger, were hard, her lips pressed into a thin line. Mom, what's going on? She asked, her tone accusing. You've been acting strange, secretive. Are you hiding something? I leaned on my cane, my heart steady despite the challenge in her voice. I'd known this moment was coming, had prepared for it, but facing her now, I felt a pang of grief for the little girl she'd once been, the one who'd clung to me when storms rolled through. That girl was gone, replaced by this woman who saw me as an obstacle. I smiled faintly, deflecting. Just getting old. Clara, I said. You know how it is. Her eyes narrowed, unconvinced, but she didn't press further. Instead, she launched into a lecture about my health, my expenses, the burden I was placing on her and James. There it was again, that word. Burden. It cut deeper this time, knowing she'd say it to my face. I let her talk, her words washing over me like a cold tide. She spoke of selling the house, of moving me to a facility where I'd be more comfortable. Comfortable for whom? I wanted to ask, but I held my tongue. Instead, I watched her, noting the way her hands clenched, the way her voice rose when she mentioned the cost of my care. She was building a case, justifying her impatience, her greed. When she finished, I nodded slowly, as if considering her words. I'll think about it, I said, my voice calm. She seemed satisfied, her shoulders relaxing, and left soon after, promising to check in tomorrow. I stood in the garden, the weight of her words lingering, and knew I couldn't delay much longer. The confrontation was coming, whether I wanted it or not. That evening, I sat with Sarah in the sunroom, the fading light casting long shadows across the floor. She was quieter than usual, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. "Is everything okay, Eleanor?" she asked. I wanted to tell her everything about the will, the letter, the betrayal, but I couldn't. Not yet. Instead, I asked her to read to me a poetry book she'd brought last week. Her voice was soft, steady, as she read lines about forgiveness and redemption, words that stirred something deep in me. I wondered if I could forgive Clara and James, if I could find a way to love them despite their cruelty. The thought lingered, but it was overshadowed by the clarity of my decision. Sarah deserved what I was giving her, not because she'd asked for it, but because she'd earned it through her kindness, her loyalty. The next day, James came alone, a rare occurrence. He looked tired, his eyes shadowed, his usual detachment replaced by a nervous energy. He sat across from me in the living room, his hands clasped tightly. "Mom, we need to talk about the future," he said, his voice low. "Clara's worried about you, about the house. It's a lot for you to manage." I raised an eyebrow, sensing the rehearsed nature of his words. They'd been talking, plotting, and now he was here to soften the ground. I let him continue, his words circling around the same theme of me frailty. Their concern, the need to plan ahead. It was a performance, one I'd seen before, but it still hurt. I thought of the letter in my study, the words I'd written to him, and felt a flicker of doubt. Could I really cut them out so completely? But then I remembered their voices, their dismissal, and the doubt hardened into resolve. I decided to push back, just a little, to see how he'd react. "James," I said, my voice steady, "what if I don't want to sell the house? What if I have other plans?" His eyes widened, a flash of panic crossing his face before he masked it with a smile. "Of course, Mom. It's your decision," he said, but his tone was strained. "We just want what's best for you." I nodded, letting the moment pass, but I saw the truth in his eyes, fear, not of losing me, but of losing what he thought was his. When he left, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The pieces were falling into place, the moment of revelation drawing closer. I called Margaret that night, asking her to prepare for the final step. "I want to do it soon," I told her, "before they push me any further." She agreed, her voice steady, and promised to have everything ready. Sarah's visit the next morning was different. She seemed distracted, her usual warmth tempered by a quiet unease. As we sat in the garden, she confessed that Clara had called her, asking questions about her work, her time with me. She seemed suspicious, Sarah said, her brow furrowed, like she thought I was up to something. My heart sank. Clara was circling, sensing a threat to her inheritance. I reassured Sarah, telling her not to worry, but inside, I was seething. They were already turning on her, the one person who'd shown me genuine care. That night, I made a decision. I couldn't wait any longer. The will would be revealed, the letter delivered, and the truth laid bare. I was ready to face them, to reclaim my dignity, my life, in the only way I knew how. The air in the house felt charged, like the moments before a thunderstorm breaks. I spent the morning in my study, the will and letter laid out on my desk, their weight both literal and symbolic. I'd asked Margaret to come that afternoon, to finalize the details and prepare for the inevitable confrontation. I knew Clara and James would fight the new will, would accuse me of losing my mind or being manipulated. But I was ready. Every word in the letter was true, every decision deliberate. I wasn't doing this to hurt them, though I knew it would. I was doing it to honor myself, to give meaning to the years I'd spent loving them despite their indifference. As I sat there, tracing the edges of the envelope, I thought of Sarah, of the life she could build with what I was giving her. It wasn't just about the money or the house, it was about giving her a chance to make a difference, the way I'd always wanted to. Sarah arrived at noon, her usual warmth tempered by a quiet worry. She'd sensed the tension in the house, the way Clara and James had begun watching her, their questions sharp and probing. I wanted to tell her everything, to ease her fears, but I held back. Instead, I asked her to help me in the garden, a task that had become our ritual. We knelt side by side, pulling weeds, the earth cool beneath my fingers. I watched her work, her hands steady and sure, and felt a surge of gratitude. She'd given me more than caressed, given me purpose, a reason to keep going. As we finished, I took her hand, my voice soft but firm. "Sarah, you've been a blessing to me," I said. Her eyes widened, a flush creeping up her cheeks. But she didn't pull away. "You're family to me," I added, and meant it. She smiled, tears glistening, and for a moment, I felt whole again. Margaret arrived shortly after, her briefcase in hand, her expression calm but serious. We sat in the study, the door closed, as she reviewed the final documents. "Everything's in order," she said, sliding the will across the desk. "You just need to sign." I took the pen, my hand steady despite the weight of the moment. As I signed, I felt a release, as if I were shedding years of guilt and doubt. Margaret watched me, her eyes kind but searching. "Are you sure you want to do this now?" she asked. I nodded. "It's time." She suggested we call Clara and James, to tell them in person, but I hesitated. I wanted them to read the letter first, to understand my reasons before they lashed out. Margaret agreed, promising to deliver the will and letter when the time came. As she left, I felt a strange mix of peace and dread. The die was cast. That evening, Clara called, her voice tight with suspicion. "Mom, what's going on with your lawyer?" she asked. I saw her car in the driveway. I feigned confusion, my heart racing. "Just some paperwork, Clara," I said. "Nothing to worry about." She didn't believe May could hear it in her silence, but she didn't push. Instead, she said she and James would come by tomorrow, to talk things over. I agreed, knowing this was the moment I'd been preparing for. After hanging up, I sat in the dark, the house quiet except for the ticking of the grandfather clock. I thought of my mother, how she'd faced her own battles with grace and strength. I wanted to be like her, to face this with dignity, no matter what came next. The next morning, I woke early, my body aching but my mind clear. Sarah arrived, her face pale, and told me Clara had called her again, this time accusing her of influencing me. "She thinks I'm after your money," Sarah said, her voice trembling with hurt. I took her hand, my anger flaring. "You've done nothing wrong," I told her. "This is about them, not you." I wanted to tell her about the will, to reassure her, but I held back. It wasn't fair to burden her with the truth before I'd faced my children. Instead, I asked her to stay for the day, to be there when Clara and James arrived. She agreed, her loyalty unwavering, and I felt a surge of gratitude that nearly brought me to tears. Clara and James arrived at noon, their faces a study in contrast, Clara's sharp and accusing, James's guarded and uneasy. They sat in the living room, the same room where we'd once played board games and laughed together. I stood before them, my cane in hand, my heart steady. "I have something to tell you," I began, my voice calm but firm. Clara's eyes narrowed. and James shifted uncomfortably. I took a breath, the weight of years pressing against my chest, and began to speak. I told them what I'd overheard, how their words had broken me, how I'd realized they saw me as nothing more than a burden. Clara's face flushed, her mouth opening to protest. But I held up a hand, silencing her. I spoke of Sarah, of her kindness, her selflessness, and how she'd shown me what family could be. And then, I told them about the will. The room went still, the air thick with shock. Clara's eyes widened, her breath catching, while James stared at the floor, his hands clenched. The truth was out, and there was no going back. The silence in the living room was deafening, broken only by the faint tick of the grandfather clock. Clara's face was a mask of fury, her eyes blazing as she leaned forward, her voice low and venomous. "You're giving everything to her." She spat, the word "her" dripping with disdain. "That nurse. You're throwing away our inheritance for someone who's been here for what? A few months." James sat frozen, his hands gripping the arms of the chair, his face pale. I stood my ground, my cane a steady anchor, my heart pounding but resolute. "This isn't about throwing anything away," I said, my voice calm despite the storm in the room. "It's about giving to someone who sees me, who cares for me, not just what I can leave behind." Clara laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that cut through me. "You're delusional, Mom," she said. "She's manipulated you, and you're too weak to see it." The accusation stung, but I'd expected it. I looked at James, hoping for something regret, understanding, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "I heard you, Clara," I said. "That night in the kitchen, when you called me a burden." I heard James agree, or at least not disagree. "You broke my heart. Both of you." Clara's face faltered for a moment, a flicker of guilt crossing her features, but it was gone as quickly as it came. "You were eavesdropping," she snapped. "That's what this is about. A misunderstanding." I shook my head, my voice steady. "It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was the truth you didn't think I'd hear." James finally looked up, his eyes glistening, but he said nothing. I wanted to reach out to him, to pull him back to the boy who'd once clung to me, but I couldn't. Not now. Instead, I continued, telling them about the letter, how it explained everything: their betrayal, my pain, my choice. "You'll read it when the time comes," I said. "I hope it helps you understand." Clara stood, her hands clenched into fists. "You can't do this," she said. "We'll fight it. We'll prove you're not in your right mind." Her words were a knife, but I was ready for them. "You can try," I said, my voice steady. "But I'm not the frail old woman you think I am. My mind is clear, and my decision is final." James finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "Mom, please," he said. "Don't do this. We're your family." The word family hit me like a wave, stirring memories of the life we'd shared, the love I'd poured into them. But it wasn't enough to sway me. "Family doesn't treat each other like this," I said softly. "Sarah has been more family to me than either of you." Clara stormed out, slamming the door behind her, while James lingered, his eyes pleading. But he left too, and the house fell silent again. I sat alone in the living room, the weight of the confrontation settling over me. I'd expected their anger, their accusations, but it still hurt. I thought of Sarah, who'd been in the kitchen, out of sight but close enough to hear. I found her there, her face pale, her hands trembling as she washed dishes. "Eleanor, I didn't know," she said, her voice breaking. I don't want your money. Your house, I just want you to be okay. I took her hands, my own steady despite the ache in my chest. I know, I said. That's why I chose you. I told her everything, then the will, the letter, my reasons. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't protest, didn't try to change my mind. Instead, she hugged me, her warmth a reminder of why I'd made this choice. The days that followed were tense, the house a battleground of unspoken resentments. Clara called, her voice cold, demanding to see the will, threatening legal action. James stopped coming, his absence a wound I hadn't expected. I leaned on Sarah more than ever, her presence a steady light in the darkness. We spent hours together, talking, laughing, planning. I told her about my dreams, the ones I'd buried long ago, and she shared hers, her vision for the clinic growing clearer with every conversation. I felt alive again, my purpose renewed. But the shadow of Clara and James lingered, their anger a constant threat. Margaret warned me they were consulting lawyers, gathering evidence to contest the will. I wasn't afraid. I'd made my choice, and it was the right one. One evening, as Sarah and I sat in the garden, the sky streaked with pink and gold, I felt a shift in myself. The anger I'd carried, the pain of their betrayal, was fading, replaced by a quiet acceptance. I'd done what I needed to do, not just for Sarah, but for myself. I'd reclaimed my dignity, my worth, in the face of their dismissal. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the roses, I realized I was ready to face whatever came next. Clara and James could fight, could rage, but they couldn't take this from me. I was no longer a burden. I was Eleanor, a woman who'd chosen her own path, who'd found a family in the most unexpected place. The weeks that followed were a blur of tension and quiet resolve. Clara's calls became more frequent, each one laced with a mix of anger and desperation. She alternated between pleading and threatening, her voice sharp over the phone as she demanded I reconsider, accusing Sarah of manipulating me, accusing me of betraying my own blood. I listened, my heart heavy but unmoved, and repeated the same calm response. My decision is made. Clara, you'll understand when you read the letter. James remained silent, his absence a louder rebuke than Clara's words. I missed him, the boy who'd once drawn me pictures and promised to take care of me when I was old. But that boy was gone, replaced by a man who saw me as an obstacle to his ambitions. I grieved for them both, but I didn't waver. The will was my truth, my justice, and I would stand by it. Sarah, bless her, stayed by my side, her presence a constant comfort. She didn't ask about the will again, didn't press for details, but I could see the weight it placed on her. She was scared, not of the money or the house, but of the rift it had caused. One afternoon, as we sat in the sunroom, the light filtering through the stained glass windows, she confessed her fears. I don't want to come between you and your family, she said, her voice trembling. I don't want them to hate me. I took her hand, my grip firm despite the tremble in my own. They made their choices. Sarah, I said, this isn't about you, it's about them, and what they've done. She nodded, but her eyes were troubled, and I knew she carried the burden of my decision as much as I did. Margaret kept me updated on the legal front. Clara and James had hired a lawyer, a sharp young man who was already digging into my mental state, my relationship with Sarah, anything they could use to contest the will. Margaret was confident, her voice steady as she assured me the documents were ironclad. They'll make noise, she said, but they won't win. I trusted her, but the thought of a legal battle exhausted me. I didn't want to spend my final years in court, fighting the children I'd raised. I wanted peace, a chance to live the time I had left with purpose. I began making plans, small ones at first, sorting through old photos, donating clothes, clearing out the clutter of a lifetime. It was cathartic, a way of letting go of the past and embracing the future I was building for Sarah. One evening, I found an old box of letters in the attic, written by my mother during her final years. I sat on the floor, dust motes swirling in the dim light, and read her word stories of her struggles, her hopes for me, her unwavering love. I cried then, not for Clara and James, but for the woman I'd been, the one who'd fought so hard to give her children a better life. I realized I'd been carrying their betrayal like a weight, letting it define me. But reading my mother's letters reminded me of my own strength, the resilience that had carried me through loss and hardship. I was still that woman, and I had more to give. I tucked the letters away, a quiet resolve settling over me. I would face Clara and James one last time, not with anger, but with clarity. The confrontation came sooner than I expected. Clara arrived unannounced one morning, James trailing behind her, their faces grim. They sat in the living room, the same room where I'd revealed the truth, and demanded to see the will. I refused, my voice steady. "You'll see it when the time comes," I said. Clara's eyes flashed, her voice rising. "You're destroying our family, Mom," she said. "You're choosing a stranger over us." I looked at her, then at James, and felt a calm certainty. "I'm choosing someone who sees me," I said. "Someone who doesn't call me a burden behind my back." James flinched, his face crumpling. But Clara was relentless, her words a torrent of accusations. I let her rage, her voice echoing through the house, until she finally stormed out, James following silently. As the door slammed, I felt a strange peace. The truth was out, and I was free. That night, I sat with Sarah in the garden, the stars bright above us. I told her about my mother, about the letters, about the strength I'd rediscovered. She listened, her eyes shining, and when I finished, she hugged me, her warmth a balm to my soul. "You're the strongest person I know, Eleanor," she said. I smiled, tears in my eyes, and knew I'd made the right choice. The battle with Clara and James wasn't over, but I was ready. I'd found my purpose, my family, in the woman beside me, and no one could take that away. The months that followed were a strange mix of calm and chaos. Clara and James escalated their efforts, their lawyers sending letters that questioned my mental capacity, my judgment, my relationship with Sarah. Margaret handled it all, her responses sharp and unyielding, but the strain was undeniable. I felt it in the quiet moments, when the house was still, and I wondered if I'd done the right thing. Not for Sarah, she deserved every bit of what I'd given her, but for Clara and James. They were my children, my blood, and despite everything, I loved them. I'd written the letter to explain, to bridge the gap between us, but I wasn't sure they'd ever understand. Still, I held firm, my resolve anchored by the life I was building, the legacy I was leaving with Sarah. Sarah herself was a revelation. She began planning the clinic in earnest, sketching out ideas on napkins, her excitement contagious. I helped where I could, offering advice, sharing stories of my own struggles to build something from nothing. We spent evenings in the study, papers spread across the desk, dreaming of a future where her clinic would thrive. I saw my younger self in her, the woman who'd fought for her children, who'd refused to let hardship define her. But Sarah was different. Her dreams weren't just for herself, but for others, for the people she'd help. I felt proud, not just of her, but of myself, for seeing her worth, for choosing her. Clara and James didn't give up. They came to the house one last time. A final attempt to sway me. It was a cold morning, the air sharp with the promise of winter. And they sat across from me in the living room, their faces a mix of desperation and defiance. Clara spoke first, her voice softer than before, almost pleading. "Mom, we're sorry," she said. "We didn't mean to hurt you. We're your family, doesn't that mean anything?" James nodded, his eyes meeting mine for the first time in weeks. "We love you, Mom," he said, his voice breaking. "We just want to take care of you." I wanted to believe them, wanted to see the children I'd raised. But their words felt rehearsed, their apologies too late. I thought of the letter, still sealed, waiting for them. "I love you too," I said, my voice steady. "But love isn't enough. You made me feel like a burden, and I can't forget that." They left soon after, their silence heavy, and I knew it was the last time we'd speak like this. The legal battle loomed, but Margaret was confident. "They don't have a case," she said, her voice firm. "Your will is clear, your mind sound. They can fight, but they won't win." I trusted her, but more than that, I trusted myself. I'd made my choice, not out of anger, but out of a need to reclaim my dignity, to honor the person I'd become. Sarah was my legacy, not just in the money or the house, but in the hope she carried, the kindness she'd shown me. I began to let go of the guilt, the doubt, and embrace the peace that came with my decision. I spent my days with Sarah, gardening, reading, living in a way I hadn't in years. The house, once a prison of memories, felt alive again, filled with laughter and purpose. One evening, as we sat in the garden, the roses blooming despite the chill, Sarah turned to me, her eyes bright. "Eleanor, I want you to be part of the clinic," she said. "Not just with the money, but with me, building it." I smiled, tears welling up. "I'd like that," I said, and meant it. We talked late into the night, planning, dreaming, and I felt a joy I hadn't known in years. The battle with Clara and James faded into the background, their anger a distant storm. I'd found my family, my purpose, in the woman beside me, and no court could take that away. As winter settled in, I felt my strength waning, my body reminding me of its limits. But my heart was full, my mind clear. I'd faced my children, my past, and come out stronger. The letter waited, a final message to Clara and James, a hope that they'd find their own redemption. But I didn't need their approval, their forgiveness. I'd forgiven myself for loving them too much, for holding on too long. I was Eleanor, not a burden, but a woman who'd chosen her own path, who'd found love and purpose in the twilight of her life. And as I sat with Sarah, the stars bright above us, I knew I'd made the right choice, not just for her, but for me.